This video is brought to you by support from viewers like yourself through Patreon. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the MACO Macarias, and you've seen nothing like these. These are basically a cost no object open baffle design, and I consider them the king of open baffle designs, the pinnacle of open baffle designs, and the sensei of open baffle designs. But wait, what is a open baffle speaker design anyways? Well, open baffle speakers are called open baffles because they do not have a box. They're a boxless design in a speaker design world that's designed to get rid of the boxy resonance because again, there's no box. Just the baffle with drivers mounted on them, and in my opinion, for sure, one of the best designs that allow you to hear just the drivers without the cabinet coloration. And of course, that was just a short explanation of what open baffle designs are. There's many benefits and cons that comes attached to open baffle designs, as with any designs out there, but that goes beyond the scope of this video. But talking about the drivers, the Macaria uses two 15-inch paper cone MACO drivers. These drivers are made by a respectable manufacturer on the MACO's brand and specifications. And starting with the top driver with the very cool looking face plug, handles almost all the frequencies except bass under 300 Hz. And the reason the crossover point is so low is because the top driver with the phase plug is a full range driver that is capable of playing all of the frequencies by itself. In fact, many people out there use just this driver by itself on a baffle to handle all the frequencies from bass to treble. However, as I mentioned in my previous videos with full range drivers are also called wideband drivers because they cover a wide range of frequencies, but they do tend to fall off earlier in the bass and treble. Hence why 15-inch woofer are on the speaker to augment that bass. The rather large 15-inch driver helps to achieve the bass down to 30 Hz and honestly down to 20 Hz in my room without a problem, while the phase plug helps to extend the high frequency, making the speaker more of a true full range speaker. Also, this eye-catching phase plug not only allows the high frequency to extend more, but also it helps with dispersion, which means that the phase plug is designed so that the sound travels more directly to the listener instead of interacting with the large cone surface and causing reflections. Also, as I've talked about in other videos, having a single driver play everything above 300 Hz means that all the source of the sound is coming from one point source. So all the instruments, all the vocals is coming from one driver, one point source, instead of multiple sound sources coming from multiple drivers like you see in traditional two-way or three-way speaker designs that's crossed over much higher in the frequencies. The baffle design itself is basically sculpted to be a large waveguide, improving dispersion, sensitivity, and minimizing unwanted artifacts like diffraction and reflections that can be a concern with large baffles like these. Now, prices vary very drastically depending on the material of the baffle you choose for this speaker, and we'll get to the pricing in a minute here, but the pair I have here is the granite finish. And as you can imagine, it is back-breakingly heavy at 140 pounds per speaker. MACO claims that the heavy nature of the finish allows the speakers to have no room for resonance. However, of course, anything mounted to a driver has its sonic effects as well as inherent benefits. And MACO claims to have utilized these natural effects and benefits to produce slightly different tunings depending on the materials of the baffle, with granite and quartz baffles like this to have an advantage in soundstage and air, birch plywood finish with advantages in neutrality, and solid wood finishes being more of an overall warmer sound. Of course, these are just claims by MACO and I have not heard every single finish, but I did visit their listening room earlier in last year and I did hear the wood finish, which did to me sound a little bit more warmer than the granite finish I have here. Now, talking about the different baffle materials, might as well talk about the pricing. Prices vary from $6,000 to $13,000 depending on the choice of material. The granite model here with the optional floating stand from MACO for additional $500 makes the total price of the speaker you see here $13,500 and the most expensive option, while other materials are quite a bit less, with solid wood being $9,500 and birch plywood being $6,300. What's even crazier is that they are doing a pre-launch special and until the end of this month, a one-time discount of 40% off. You simply go to getmaco.macoacoustic.com and put in your email and a deposit of $1 to secure your 40% discount for when the Macaria speakers start to ship around June or July this year. Again, I do have to repeat that this insane sale is only limited to the end of this month, February. 2024, and the price will go back to its normal retail price after the pre-launch special expires. If you are also curious to check them out in person, they will also be exhibiting at the Expo HIFI show this April in room 686. Crossovers are external, and I was given 3 different prototype crossover tunings and the honor to pick the final tuning with the designer in beta testing. And although all 3 of them sounded pretty great at this stage in the beta test, I still had a strong preference for this one right here, and the designer agreed. So this will be the final crossover. However, MACO says that every component will be much higher grade parts from brands like Clarity Audio, enclosed in a pretty box like this one. Also, the connectors from the crossover to the speaker will most likely change as well. The Macarias are no doubt ridiculously heavy and quite big loudspeakers with big drivers. However, despite its intimidating stature, I was quite surprised by the fact that this speaker somehow manages to disappear in front of me, despite being so big, with that focused and coherent center imaging that is just locked in place, no matter if I have the speakers towed in towards me or out towards the room. Now, side imaging and pinpointing where every instrument is to the side isn't quite as impressive, and I've heard better, but that also may be because of the rather large soundstage, wide soundstage that these speakers create. Soundstage is quite deep with great layering from behind where the soundstage is set to where the listener is sitting. For example, when I hear a guitar being plucked or strummed, I hear the initiation of the pluck and strum behind the speakers where the soundstage is set and starting, but between the speaker and myself, I hear the decay of that strum or pluck very accurately, adding to that musical and sense of realism in my space. The bass is deep to where I don't feel a need for a subwoofer at all, and that 15-inch woofer moves quite a bit of air, which results in a bass that I always talk about and love, the bass that you really feel with your chest and body rather than just hearing it. And for me, that is really a rare of an experience with Open Baffle speakers, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit here. I personally prefer the Macaria loudspeakers to be way out into the room around 6 feet from the back wall, but the bass was still controlled and not boomy with only about 2 feet out into the room. Now, if you must put these speakers closer to the back wall, crossover tuning with less bass output option is available according to MACO. Now back to the Open Baffle bass. Now Open Baffle bass from a baffle speaker or an Open Baffle subwoofer for example are quite different from box designs in that it's not as pressurized, it's not as impactful, it's not as chest pounding as a pressurizing sealed box design or ported designs for that matter. The bass out of an Open Baffle speaker is more linear in my opinion, and overall more of a pleasant filling sound that fills the room instead of pressurizing it. So you don't feel that kind of bodily sensation as much or that punchy dynamic sound that you would get from a box design. However, the Macarias are punchier than other Open Baffle designs I've heard and still manages to have some good pressure effect with chest pounding bass, especially at louder volumes. Don't get me wrong, by the way, these speakers still create exceptional, extended, textured bass at low volumes. However, the dynamic punch, the pressurization, the chest pounding effect, the more punchy dynamic effect is more evident when you crank up the speakers at louder volumes. The mid-range is quite beautiful with the speaker with its coherent vocals and instruments that have good texture and nuance to the sound. That just simply, for me, it just melts me and gives me a very musical experience. However, it is not the most detailed mid-range nor the most attention-grabbing mid-range, but rides a good balance between warmth and transparency. Now, if I have to put my finger on it, I will say that the overall tonality of this loudspeaker tilts slightly towards the warm and musical and rich sound with focus on body of the sound and musicality, with transparency and detail being part of the sound, but not being the main focus to the overall sound signature. Now, in my humble opinion, I think they really nailed the amount of edge to the sound, which is kind of the hard thing to do in a tuning process, I find, where, a little bit too much and it can be brittle, aggressive, and sharp sounding, while if it's too little of edge, then you get this kind of smeared, low resolution, unrefined type of feeling, smeared, crowded kind of sound. So it's a fine balance that it needs to be, and I think they really nailed it with this tuning on the speaker. The highs are much the same way in that it sounds sparkly, detailed, and sweet, but with the right amount of edge to the instruments and sound effects in the upper ranges. And I found that this kind of fine balance in the mid-range and high frequency really allowed the playback of poor recordings as well as well-recorded music to really shine. The speaker itself doesn't have enough sparkle or sharp enough edges around the instruments and vocals to destroy musical enjoyment of poorly recorded music that you and I may still enjoy due to nostalgia or other reasons. I also found that the Macarias makes some of my poor recordings sound a little more pleasant than I remember them, thanks to its more full-bodied and slightly warm mid-range and the deep extending bass. On the other hand, it has plenty enough edge and sparkle for improved or upgraded musical enjoyment of well-recorded music pieces. For example, this track right here by Yellow has a lot of sound effects, doo-doot, doo-doot, that has a lot of good spatial cues. Now, if you have too little of an edge, then you don't really hear it or appreciate the special cues as much as it's smeared and you don't know the exact placement of those sparkles and sound effects. Too much, and it can quickly sound too lean, bright, and quite literally murder your ears. Playing this track, I found that the Macarias really took advantage and portrayed the spatial cues that this track provided. And going through other tracks in my playlist, I personally found Macarias to have one of the best balance for enjoying playback of both poor and well-recorded music. The MACO Macarias are pretty sensitive speakers at 91 dB sensitivity, which means that you don't really need to worry too much about the power requirements for the speaker, as it can be driven with very low wattage speakers very easily. My rule of thumb was that anything above 20 watts of power should be easily able to drive these speakers in most rooms, unless you're in a very huge room. Then I would say you'll need at least 50 watts or more. Now, I've tried with several different amplifiers, but the first amplifier I tried was the Brunicle Terra integrated amplifier that I reviewed last year. This pairing retained the warm holographic mid-range, but made the overall sound impression tilt slightly towards the cooler side than warm. Further listening through my playlist, I got the impression that this amplifier pairing gave the Macarias a sense of purity and transparency to the overall sound, with more sparkle and excitement in the upper mid-range and treble region, but at the expense of reduced bass output and control. It also opened up the soundstage, and the sense of spaciousness was greatly improved, with great holographic layering between me and the speakers. Putting these pieces together, I found myself perceiving the sound to be higher resolution, open and spacious, with great musicality, even though some tracks were slightly border bright for me for my personal liking. As great as the Brunicles were with the Macarias, it simply did not bring out the same bass output in amount, control, and authority as the AGD audience did with the Macarias. Because this is not an integrated amplifier but a separate amplifier, it requires an external preamplifier, and for that I used the internal preamplifier of the PS Audio Stellar Go DAC, the Denafrips Athena preamplifier, the flagship from Denafrips, and the A&K Mentor Tube preamplifier, which I love very much. And honestly, any of these three preamplifiers with the AGD audience created great bass output, control, dynamics, and most importantly, great chest feeling, bodily sensation bass that I was hoping for. However, I did find the mid-range to be the most beautiful and warm sounding with the A&K preamplifier, while the internal preamplifier of the Stellar Gold DAC to be surprisingly good match in bringing out the most quick and snappy attack and decay without being aggressive. The Denafrips preamplifier also brought out good details and greater separation at the expense of slightly leaner mid-range presentation, but nevertheless, I found the sound to be incredibly detailed and transparent but super refined with the AGD, with beautiful warm harmonics coming through the speaker's mid-range, with spaciousness in spades, but not as large of a soundstage or openness as the Brunicle integrated amplifier. Now, I have given you two of my favorite pairings to the Macarias loudspeakers, but I've tried a lot of different amplifiers with this speaker, and I found that the Macarias are very receptive speakers to the quality of the amplifier you put behind it, as well as the sonic signature of the amplifier, which means that you and I can take full advantage of this feature of this loudspeaker to get the sound we want to achieve. For example, I even paired this speaker up with the 1970s vintage Dynaco ST70 tube amplifier, and it gave the Macarias a little retro vibe with a classic vintage mid-centric sound. I always personally associate the sound to the feeling, the vibe of you walking into a vintage cafe, music cafe, because it's a pretty hard sound to describe, not gonna lie. But it's almost like watching an old film on VHS or on a projector screen. It is definitely lower resolution and definitely colored, but so pleasing and musical sounding, with music flowing in the air with no offensive tones to note of. Now, in terms of a comparison to other speakers in the market, I believe it's only fair to compare the speaker to speakers that provide equal good value that is a boxless design. The Magnepan 3.7i is a $9,000 panel speaker, and the transparency, the openness, and the speed of a panel speaker that results from having absolutely no cabinetry at all is really hard to beat from my experience, even for a high-end open baffle design like the Macarias. However, the Macarias are not too far behind, especially in that openness and transparency, thanks to its open baffle design nature. While many are perfectly happy with the way bass is produced with the Magnepan speakers, bass isn't the strongest suit with panel speakers or Magnepan speakers in particular. And this is especially true when comparing to a speaker like the Macarias. Not only are the Macarias able to create deeper and more impactful bass, it simply has more bass output. On top of that, the 15-inch bass driver is able to move a lot of air, creating the feel it in your chest type of bodily bass experience that I never heard from Magnepan 3.7i's personally. Overall, the Macarias are warmer and richer sounding with incredible scale and dynamics from dynamic drivers that panel speakers like Magnepans are often lacking in trade for ultimate transparency, openness, and speed that dynamic driver designs can only dream of creating. In the end, it really comes down to which of these characteristics you find more value in and which of these characteristics will bring you the most musical enjoyment according to your taste. Next up is the GR Research NX-Treme loudspeakers. This is a flagship GR Research Open Baffle speaker that is sold as a kit only at this time of the video. So yes, this means that you have to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty, but because of that, the price point is very attractive and lower than if you were to buy it as a finished speaker. The kit is priced at $5,178 with the upgraded crossover parts, and I heard the speaker in its full glory in the designer's own listening room, in Danny's own listening room, during my visit to GR Research. The MACO Macarias are right off the bat more full and meatier sounding in the mid-range, while the NX-Treme sounded leaner but more transparent and nuanced in the mid-range. Soundstage, imaging, and layering is impressive on both loudspeakers. However, it was kind of hard for me to decipher which one had a larger soundstage or a deeper soundstage, since I did hear the NX-Tremes in a different room than mine, and one speaker didn't particularly stand out to me to have substantially wider or deeper soundstage than the other speaker. However, in terms of imaging, I can confidently say that the Macarias imaging was more locked in place and more coherent. On the other hand, I do distinctively remember the side imaging being easier to pinpoint on the NX-Tremes in Danny's listening room. As for the bass, I heard the NX-Tremes with two triple-threat servo-controlled open baffle subwoofers from GR Research. These subwoofers are also sold just as a kit and comes in around $2,000 for each one, or $4,000 for the pair that I heard, which brings the total price to $9,178. However, even then, I honestly do prefer the bass out of the Macarias, as I perceived it to have a deeper, visceral, authoritative bass and loaded the room with more pressurization, giving that feel it in your chest type of bass that I love. The GR Research NX-Tremes does have the same amount of scale and bass output amount. However, I did find that the bass on the NX-Tremes to be a classic open baffle kind of sound in terms of the bass, where I mentioned before the classic sound of filling the room instead of pressurizing it, so you don't really get that pressurization, feel it in your chest type of bass out of the NX-Tremes. Which again, isn't to say one speaker is better than the other. They offer different types of bass presentation as it does in the mid-range. And stating the obvious, but it really comes down to, are you a DIY kit person or someone that is looking for a finished speaker at high value? So that's it from me, and I hope this video was helpful, entertaining, and informative. And if it was any of the three, then please consider clicking that like button. It helps me out tremendously and it doesn't cost you anything. And most importantly, that like button really helps me keep doing what I love on this channel. And also, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next video or any of my episodes in the future, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Until next time.